Hey everybody, how you doing? This is Blake Preston, Royal LePage Commercial Real Estate. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm glad to have you here. This is a new broadcast in regards to the current climate in the Canadian commercial real estate market. So here we go. I don't know if you guys have heard, but there's I don't know, some sort of disruption happening. COVID? That's something. It's welcome to the madness. Anyway, we're in the midst of it, so we got our boots on and we are stomping through. Just some cool stuff that I'm gonna come across and bring up later in the podcast. I mean, at least like where Canada stood coming into this, what we can expect, based on some certain key indicators that are traditionally, leaned on to kind of understand a situation like this. Not that we've gone through a pandemic, but we've had recessions, we've had compressions of the economy. So, as we move forward and we look at the different segments of the commercial real estate market, industrial has remained strong. Obviously, e-commerce is driving that, and there's a bunch of other factors as well. We'll dive into as many of those as we can as we go through this. But when you look at like office segment is definitely tapered. There, a lot of people are talking about how to reconfigure office to be able to meet the demands of what a reopening looks like, right? So, and in all this, people working from home, there's companies are changing their perspective on having staff working at home and that sort of thing. So it's definitely in a transition. So office right now, I mean, I haven't got a lot of stats. I haven't been able to dig stuff up about how many landlords are actually getting paid and aren't getting paid in the office sphere right now. Industrial landlords are getting paid a lot more frequently than office landlords. But as far as like multifamily goes, still all the tailwinds are in place for multifamily, and there's really the case that with all the aid the government is providing, like people are able to pay their rent. Now when it comes to the retail sector, it's definitely going through a transition phase right now, and it's something that definitely was in a transitory phase coming into this because of where e-commerce has been, but this situation has greatly exacerbated where retail is at right now. Right now, retail and industrial, the two asset classes are basically becoming entwined with one another. So, with retail hurting, industrial is doing really well. There's a few examples of how these asset classes are starting to intersect. And, you may have read about Shopify last week. Or a couple of weeks ago. They were briefly Canada's most valuable company, and they're a platform that competes with Amazon. So good Canadian success story. And with Shopify, to be able to compete with Amazon, they had to close a deal, go to $500 million they had to spend to acquire a company that provides technology to warehousing. Now, this move on their behalf is sort of a multifaceted action where it's not just a retail play, a technological play, or an industrial one. It's kind of, they're all rolled into one together, Either way, Shopify, they're just a good example of how companies in this time and in the e-commerce space are really having to pull threads of all different parts of the commercial real estate world to make their retail, industrial, technological business work and make sense, right? So, whether it's grapefruits or guitars, right now it seems like some companies are really not overly concerned about the cost of real estate. They're right now is floating around a transaction where, because of fiduciary duty, they can't release the name of the company, but it's a large national grocer, and they're acquiring a large industrial building that they're going to use as part of their last mile. And apparently the sale price is going to be higher than asking, or like what they were told the building was worth, from their internal real estate guidance. Because at this point, inventory is very low, and it has been for a long time. But the need to grow their business is, it vastly outweighs what you might have to spend on real estate. Because as we've been talking about previously, like with every new $1 billion in e-commerce, there's a necessity for 1.3 million or 1.2 million square feet of industrial space, to facilitate all those goods being stored. And that's big sizes, big spaces, small spaces, 2,000 square feet to 1 million square feet, right? So as far as things moving forward, like pure industrial right now is holding up pretty well. Like we're seeing a bit of softening in rent collection with small multi-bay tenant buildings that have like local tenants, mom and pop shops. But the harsh reality in the retail sector is that type of experiential store can't be replicated online. And, they were meant to anchor malls, and obviously no one's going to the mall right now. So they're getting crushed, like, by the current state of the market. Going forward, it's kind of an ingrained expectation that landlords will be working with tenants to achieve mutual success, because there's really, the whoever owns the retail play, whether it's a REIT or an individual, they need to work together as this moves forward, because some retail buildings that have 30,000 square foot pads that are vacant are being utilized to warehouse like surplus goods that usually would be distributed from a warehousing space. It's just that it's available floor space and it's available rent, but a retail rent is going to be chopped by like 2/3 if you're going industrial. I mean, you might get something a little higher than that, but if you're looking at a pure value perspective of your building, if your retail rates get cut by 2/3 or even half, like there goes your value of the building, right? So I think what we're going to see for restaurants is things like the reemergence of pure percentage rent deals, where it's like, they take a percentage of what you generate. So that way there's like a mutual assistance. There's also a mutual, understanding to work together to make sure everyone is profitable and, the businesses are successful. So what I'm seeing is Brookfield, the company that owns my company, Royal LePage Commercial, my company's taking this a bit further. They've announced plans to invest $5 billion to help tenants in their buildings. And so, I mean, that's an unprecedented step. I'm not seeing that very frequently, but there will be more stories like that coming out. I remember after 2008, talking to some tenants, and a lot of people were saying like, well, I survived 2008 because my landlord gave me a cut on rent or whatever they did. And, some of these tenants are just forever faithful after that, right? So, there's nothing better than goodwill. So if you can this is an opportunity for landlords to build that up, should they have to. So, and they do have to, right? I think there's a definite need for people to lean on each other at this point. But right now, like in the retail sector, upcoming, there's going to be a lot of talk about department stores, because we're starting to see bankruptcies and many large retailers filing for bankruptcy protection. Like it's here and it's on the way and it's happening. So, none of this is surprising given the current conditions, but the department store model has definitely been in a decline for the past few decades. But more and more, the COVID crisis is exacerbating negative trends that we've seen in the retail sector. The real question for all of us at this point, obviously, is when will social distancing be over? Because retail and social distancing do not work well together whatsoever. It's impossible to have like an experiential store at a mall in a 1,000 square foot pad and have, people in there. Like, good example, think about the Apple Store. The Apple Store is tables, computers, iPads, phones, everywhere. And, if this is in a socially distanced situation, there is no way that you're going to be able to maintain the level of business that you had previously, or even be able to maintain the level of business to, pay those rents. So everything from high-end retail to low-end retail is experienced. They're getting crushed. It's a different time for them, definitely. And what isn't in question is how central the full integration of shopping technology and stores has become. Retailers that were managing things successfully, like with e-commerce and that kind of decline pre-COVID, are the ones that are going to recover quickest after the situation peters out. Like, given the current circumstance, there's much opportunity for pessimism, believe me. So I think for my own sanity, one of the things I've had to do is just turn off the news. Maybe once a week, open up Reddit and look at the coronavirus stream or look at the numbers, but only do that after you've had a glass of wine or two. I mean, it is the case that you just need to stay away from that. I mean, right now, like the IMF, once you open the news, you'll see things like, the IMF has cautioned of severe risks to the global economic outlook based on the potential resurgence of a pandemic and a prolonged period without a vaccine. Now, that being said, most in the real estate field are bullish about the future of it. Now, there's a lot of comparisons that they're making between now and the world financial crisis of 2008. And that was a time when the world economic infrastructure was on the verge of collapse. Those in the market admit they had no clue as to what was happening. They had no idea how long it would last. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, how did Canada do? And well, we emerged from that crisis relatively unscathed, as we virtually outperformed every other country in the world. And currently, I feel like there is no other country on the planet with better real estate fundamentals than Canada. While it's hard to see this in the midst of this storm, the long-term structural trends that we witnessed over the past few years are still sticking around to underpin the market. The cost of financing has recently gone down, and while it is selective, it is available. I've seen recently a transaction, and again, this kind of leans towards an elongated cycle for getting financing. But I was working on a transaction where the bank basically said at the end of the road, like, we got to push this way down the line because we are now implementing a new post-COVID stress test for businesses that they're going to lend to. But I kind of believe that, my client, I don't think he's not a Fortune 500 company. So I think he kind of fell into the bucket where they're like, okay, well, we're going to put people of this and companies of this profile into the bucket and make them pass a couple more stress tests once COVID's over to lend them money. But, they didn't say no. They just said it's going to be down the line a little bit. And I think, it depended on the size and profile of the company. Like, some companies are just getting money like right away. I know that I did my first webinar and BDC tuned in, and hi, Emil. BDC tuned in and they gave me a shout and they said, we're the one bank because we're a government institution that's getting loans out the door. And I mean, it doesn't mean that the big banks aren't getting loans out the door. They're just kind of putting roadblocks up to kind of, slow. They're not putting a stick in the spokes but they're definitely, pumping the handbrake. But BDC apparently is the group that you got to go to get your lending figured out in the most kind of expedient manner. But right now, we have to look at the unprecedented involvement of support from the federal government and the Bank of Canada. And I'm very confident, based on that we're going to weather this storm. I mean, the short term is going to be painful. And we will see crazy economic numbers, in the midst of all this. But I heard someone say, and I believe it, you got to remember the words of Wayne Gretzky. Great one, number 99. He said, you got to skate to the puck, or you have to skate to where the puck is going, not where it is. Skate where the puck is going, not where it is. Gretzky, man, he's got some sage advice for this time in the world, because we're headed towards something better eventually than the moment we find ourselves in. And I think at heart, I'm an optimist. No, I know I am. I like to pepper that with pessimism, and in the end, there's a spot for reality and realism right there in the center. But with that in mind, we have to. I think that we should kind of shift gears, and we're going to examine a few questions regarding where we're at, and to where we're going with the current state of affairs in commercial real estate. Right, so. The question is the vaccine going to end all of this, or how do we think we see the economy performing up until that point? And what happens if we don't find a vaccine? These are all very real questions, very real possibilities. And according to some, there are tangible projections that offer a glimpse of some sort of short-term rebound as the elements of the economy reopen. It's going to be like a sawtooth, or like a zigzag where it's up and down, because viruses come in waves. The Spanish flu had 3 waves, and now we're seeing a second wave in Japan, Singapore, Germany, China, but I think it's going to happen first, at least to my mind, in Quebec, because they were the hardest hit and they're opening up the quickest, right? Like the next wave is almost a given. Summer is kind of, look at Trinity Bellwoods Park in Toronto recently. 10,000 people at a park, no social distancing. Like, there are going to be cases out of that, right? So it's just, summer's kind of cheating social distancing. And a zigzag economy, though, like up and down, is better than a frozen economy, which is where we are right now. Like, zigzag is kind of on, off. And it's hard to do business in that climate, but it's better than being closed. And much better than, a couple of weeks ago where nothing was happening. So, we're still slow right now. But, some economists, when you ask them about where they see things currently, they see this not necessarily as a recession or a depression, because this is a frozen economy. I've heard some say that it's missing the point to call it a recession or a depression, because this is an unprecedented situation. And, there's certain factors that are different from a protracted situation like a recession or a depression. The current economy we're in and where we're headed is definitely hard to define, because, the sudden spike in job losses may go up to 13% of the peak. The states, like, jeeps, they're crazy getting hurt. Obviously we are too. There's certain sectors that are just, in free fall right now. But, prior to COVID, unemployment was at 5.5%. And once we get a vaccine, theoretically, it should return to somewhere around 7 to 8%, because that's the usual average during a hard recession. And, some economists are projecting 2022 is the year that things go back to normal. And this is all dependent, obviously, on if there's a vaccine that's created or a very effective treatment. But it's not really a question of if, it's a question of when. There's people saying, like, I told this story previously on this podcast, but, I was having a good conversation with a guy who works for Life Labs, and he was basically, of the opinion, like, listen, we understand the blueprint of this, because it's COVID, and we've had multiple different COVIDs. Like, it's not AIDS, so it's not completely foreign to them. And so, right now I just saw in China, they're just undergoing the second trial, which is a larger swath of vaccine treatment on people. So the first round is usually a small crowd of people, and they test it. It was positive in the results. They have a second deployment now, and it's a much larger crowd. Like, it's going to be the case that something's going to come out. And if it's not that, like, they've had promising in Africa, where they have a higher instance of AIDS, they tested an AIDS drug on people who had COVID, And one group they gave it to, another group they didn't give it to. And the group that they gave it to, in conjunction with their actual AIDS medication, they had a severe lessening, like literally leaving the emergency room sort of, response to this one drug. So, there's right now a unified front in science and technology in a way that the world has never experienced. It's always been very fractured and reactionary, and everybody in their own small pocket, but this is a worldwide response, So, we're going to have an interesting and unprecedented economy until the point that we get treatments or a vaccine. But, it's I feel like there's positivity at the end of this. And you got to kind of hang your hat on that stuff, right? Because we're all working on this together. And, yeah. All right. So, as we move forward, obviously, we're all wondering if the debt that the government is putting together to keep our citizens afloat will cause some sort of post-recession hangover. Like, we're stacking probably about $350 billion on our debt. And, like, prior to this, they were arguing over $1 billion. So, I will say, though, coming into this, when it all began, Canada was in a very good state. Coming into this, our debt to GDP ratio was way below most other countries' average, especially in the G20. And even after adding what some think will be about $350 billion in debt, our rate of recovery will be better than America and many European countries. Their debts. I mean, at this point, the World Bank has dropped interest rates. So, I saw a report where some economists did the math, and if we add $350 billion on top of our existing debt and what we've already spent, our debt payments are actually going to stay the same. The government went out and refinanced all our existing debt. So this is kind of the same as like, you buy a bigger house, but you're still making the same mortgage payments. It's not optimal, but at the end of the day, it's a better situation to be in than, struggling to get through this and then realizing that afterwards, like, your amount of payments has gone significantly higher. I mean, people complain about, liberal government or, people just like to complain, period. But in Canada, we've done a great job of working to keep things in a good alignment as we move forward in the last, I'd say 2 decades. So you got some conservative government, you got some liberal government in there as well. I mean, the pendulum goes back and forth, but in the center, we've done really well to keep Canada on track, right? So as we look at the payments staying the same because we refinanced our debts, this will ease the pressure on the government to actually do something, that's drastic. Like, obviously it's drastic to throw that much money at the debt, but at this point, they don't have to sell the house. They can keep the house and they can still live in it. We live here. We love, it's going to be fine. So, although one thing that some people say is if the payments stay the same, the government's not going to be motivated to do anything different in the future. But that is something that we could talk about in the future. So in the 80s and 90s, when we had to cut program spending, interest payments were rising 4 to 5 times faster than the GDP. But today, the opposite is happening. The GDP will be rising when we recover 4 to 5 times faster than the interest rates. So this means the interest payments after raising the debt will remain unchanged. Like as this may create a situation, it doesn't necessarily spur the government to do something to decrease the debt. Some economists are projecting the notion the government may look to increase capital gains and capital gains taxes as time moves on. I don't think this should be enacted, as small businesses will be the number one driver of recovery in the economy, and taxing capital will not be helpful to the businesses that will bring us out of this recession. But again, that's a fight for another time. So, what do we see in the future for Canadian manufacturing? If anything, this epidemic has shown us the weaknesses in the supply chain. In the last podcast, we talked about how 90% of the state's medications comes from China, and if anything, that's spurring them and us as well to claw back some of that manufacturing. Like, essential goods manufacturing will be coming back, and this is a positive for job creation and all that stuff. Keeping people working. And there's going to be definitely, not for all, but for some, a shift in philosophy for some companies, away from cutting every corner to increase profit to profit within the limits of domestic need. Now, I don't know if the government's going to address that at some point, but it's something we should definitely be having the conversation about. Like, we'll have to rely more on America coming forward and them on us for some goods and more locally manufactured items. There's definitely a pathology of deglobalization occurring, but it's not the end of the globalization movement, more a modification of the trends that were occurring. Like, a great example, again, case study, Puerto Rico. They got hit by a hurricane. At one point, they were producing 75% of the IV bags for the world, and that got disrupted because of that. So, you can't have an unsustainable system like that, especially in healthcare and essential goods. So the elements of manufacturing that are coming back are going to be centered around essential goods. And the amount of globalization that has occurred is not simply going to go away, but this is a definitive movement where a reorganization is going to help us move forward with globalization in a manner that's more holistic, and it helps all the communities. And it's just, I think it's a more responsible approach to it. But healthcare and high tech are going to be on the forefront of what stays and in turn regenerates internally in the country. Everything that was exposed by this crisis is going to get clawed back, and we've come to realize that supply chain issues are very significant in a moment like this. Like, I personally think that one thing we can do moving out of this is, obviously, infrastructure work primes the economy in a downturn. I think let's fix all the roads, let's lay some fiber optic networks. Let's do all the infrastructure work that we have been ignoring, because this is a good moment to stimulate our economy while getting work done. And, I think it's all positive stuff. You could work socially distanced if you're installing, fiber optic cable or just filling potholes. Like, because as we move forward, this is definitely exacerbating a change in the oil and gas industry. And the big thing is going to be moving into green energy. I mean, look at Calgary. My brother lives in Calgary, and they've been getting slammed for a long time. And it's really the case that there's this prevailing change in philosophy for energy for the world. Like, we're moving away from gas, and it's in its last kind of gasp. But, we obviously have a different perspective from, a G7, a G20 country than the rest of the world. But if you make this new green tech cheap, you can usurp the oil industry in all the emerging nations, right? Like, right now, the Saudis want to drive the oil price down as green comes in, and they're kind of working to price out Canada and the States, but and it's having an effect for sure. But I think for Alberta, they need to diversify. Like, the big thing about these large corporations, they're such slow moving entities, but they're grinding out and wanting more profit every quarter and growth. They've ignored the opportunity for the most part in the green sector. They obviously kind of touch on it here and there, but if one of these groups, BP, whoever, decided to jump on going all in with green, there would be a significant amount of money to be made. But I think in Alberta, there's a workforce out there that works in energy, and they understand it, and I think that they could drastically transform their economy if they kind of dove in on that. But right now, the demand for oil and gas is going to come back, but long term, all indicators are pointing towards the industry being replaced eventually. So in conclusion, Canada has started with strong fundamentals going into this, and we still have a very strong infrastructure, especially in industrial real estate. If anything, this pandemic has shown us how important supply chain is. And at the end of the day, Southwestern Ontario, Toronto, when I look at the function of our infrastructure, especially in the industrial sector, I lump the GTA in with a lot of the tertiary areas, even all the way out to like almost Hamilton, because if you're looking at a map from space, Google Maps, the 4 ports for North America that deliver all the goods to everybody are Chicago, Toronto, New York, and LA. And Toronto, by most metrics, has surpassed Chicago as far as volume and density and just business occurring within the supply chain and even just industrial sectors, period. So, coming out of this crisis, we have a strong foothold. And there are a lot of indicators that point towards the proximity of an intermodal hub bringing back prosperity to folks that have gone through depressions or, maybe not necessarily depressions, but recessions, strong ones. So coming out of the crisis, I think our curbing of reliance on China for a lot of things, I'm not saying we don't do business with them, we have to, but I see curbing our reliance on China and a thin supply chain becoming a benefit and a positive for our workforce, right? Like, this goes back to our fundamentals as a country. And in the role it will play will be a redistribution of wealth into the hands of entrepreneurs and ultimately essential workers. We're situated and ready to go, and everyone's just waiting for things to lift a little bit. I know we're in phase 1 right now, but, I would say to everyone out there, make sure you stay safe in phase 1, be good to each other, and wear a mask. Anyway, thank you all very much for listening. I'll be setting a new one up in a couple of weeks, but you stay safe, keep busy, keep working, keep making money, and we will talk soon. Be well.